That evening, an uncomfortable silence settled over the house. As I was making my way down the stairs, I unexpectedly caught part of a conversation taking place in the living room. Grandpa Henry, now 78 years old, sat quietly in the chair he had used for years. Across from him stood my father, his expression firm and unyielding. "Dad, I think it would be better if you didn't attend Jason's wedding. Please stay home this time." The words hung heavily in the air. Grandpa looked up, clearly caught off guard. His shoulders seemed to sink as he struggled to respond. "But Jason is my grandson. I've been looking forward to seeing him on his special day." Before he could say more, my mother, Patricia, stepped into the conversation. "We simply want everything to go smoothly. Emily's relatives are important people, and we don't want any awkward situations." Grandpa lowered his gaze. The disappointment on his face was impossible to miss. My father took a deep breath before speaking again. "I'm trying to create opportunities for this family and for my children. Right now, I need everything to be perfect. Please understand." The room fell silent. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Grandpa remained seated, staring at the floor while my parents considered the matter settled. I stood frozen on the staircase, unsure whether I should walk away or continue listening. Something about that moment felt deeply wrong. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 29 years old and work as a freelance writer in Portland, Oregon. At the time, I had no idea that this painful family disagreement would set in motion a chain of events that would change all of our lives in ways none of us could have imagined. Everything that followed began about 3 weeks before my brother's wedding day. My brother Jason was 26 years old and had built a promising career in marketing. He was preparing to marry Emily Thompson, a woman from a respected and influential family in Portland. On the surface, it seemed like a joyful time for everyone. In reality, tensions inside our family were growing with each passing day. To understand why my parents treated Grandpa Henry the way they did, it helps to know a little about our history. My father, Richard Mitchell, owned a successful real estate development business. He often spoke proudly about how hard he had worked to achieve everything he had. Whenever people praised his accomplishments, he liked to say that he had earned every dollar through determination and sacrifice. What most people never heard was the story from years earlier. About 15 years before, my father had faced a severe financial crisis after an investment failed. Bills piled up, creditors called constantly, and the future of his business seemed uncertain. During that difficult period, Grandpa Henry stepped in to help as much as he could. Although retired and living on a modest income, Grandpa refinanced his small home and provided $15,000 to support my father. For someone in his situation, it represented a tremendous sacrifice. Instead of gratitude, however, the gesture became a source of disappointment. My father often felt the amount had not been enough to solve his problems. The frustration lingered for years and gradually turned into resentment. I still remember one painful afternoon when I overheard an argument between them. My father spoke harshly, comparing Grandpa to other parents who had been able to provide greater financial support to their children. Grandpa stood quietly, deeply hurt by the criticism. I was 14 at the time, hiding behind a partially closed door, listening while tears filled my eyes. My mother, Patricia, had her own reasons for tension with Grandpa. She was convinced that he cared more about me than he did about Jason. From my perspective, the explanation was much simpler. I was the family member who spent the most time with him. I visited Grandpa regularly, brought him meals he enjoyed, helped with errands, and listened to stories from his decades working in the aerospace industry. Those conversations meant a great deal to both of us. Jason's relationship with Grandpa was different. Most of their interactions happened when he needed a favor or assistance with something practical. Still, my mother viewed Grandpa's closeness with me as evidence of favoritism. Whenever Grandpa gave me a small birthday present, perhaps a book he thought I would enjoy or something he had made himself, my mother would question why Jason had not received something similar. No matter how many times I tried to explain that affection grows through time spent together, the misunderstanding never disappeared. As wedding planning intensified, these family tensions became even more visible. The celebration was expected to be large and elegant, with hundreds of guests attending. Emily's parents were highly respected professionals whose opinions seemed to matter greatly to my parents. My father and mother wanted everything to appear flawless. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, Grandpa became viewed as a problem to manage rather than a loved family member. One evening, while discussing seating arrangements, the conversation turned toward where Grandpa would be placed during the reception. My mother worried that he might not feel comfortable among some of the guests and suggested moving him away from the main family table. I was shocked by the suggestion. Grandpa is part of this family, I reminded them. He belongs with us. But my concerns were dismissed. Jason sided with our parents, arguing that first impressions were important and that every detail of the wedding would be carefully noticed by Emily's relatives. Listening to him speak that way felt unsettling. I looked at my brother and barely recognized the person standing in front of me. This was the same grandfather who had sacrificed his own security to help our father through one of the hardest periods of his life. Yet somehow that history seemed forgotten. When I reminded Jason of everything Grandpa had done, he simply shrugged and said that those events belonged to an earlier generation and had nothing to do with him. At that moment, I realized the divide within our family had become much deeper than I had ever imagined. Anger surged through me, and I was ready to challenge what had just been said. Before I could speak, my father raised his voice and ended the discussion. "Sarah, this matter does not concern you." The statement would have been easier to accept if I were still a teenager. I was 29 years old, held a graduate degree, and supported myself through my own career. Yet whenever I disagreed with my parents, they treated me as though my opinions carried no weight. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly uncomfortable. One afternoon, I noticed that wedding invitations had been mailed to relatives living across the country, yet Grandpa still had not received one. When he eventually asked about it, my mother brushed the matter aside with a casual explanation. She told him there was no reason to send an invitation because he already lived under the same roof. The answer sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could not ignore the feeling that something deeper was happening. As the wedding drew closer, family gatherings became dominated by endless discussions about preparations. 2 weeks before the ceremony, we gathered for Thanksgiving at my parents' newly purchased home in West Hills. The house reflected years of professional success and was large enough to host the entire family comfortably. The dining room was beautifully arranged. Every dish was carefully prepared and displayed. The holiday meal looked as though it belonged in a magazine. Grandpa arrived carrying a homemade apple pie, a recipe he had been making for decades. It had once been one of Jason's favorite desserts. My mother thanked him politely, but quickly suggested placing it in the kitchen because there was already plenty of food. I noticed the brief look of disappointment that crossed Grandpa's face before he quietly carried the pie away. During dinner, conversations revolved almost entirely around the wedding. People discussed decorations, music, travel plans, and guest lists. Grandpa remained mostly silent. Seated near the end of the table, he listened while everyone else talked around him. Occasionally, he smiled, but he rarely joined the conversation. The sight became difficult to watch. Finally, I turned toward him. "Grandpa, are you having a good evening?" He looked at me and smiled warmly. "Of course I am. Seeing everyone together is enough for me." His answer was simple, yet it carried a sadness that was impossible to miss. Later that evening, while the rest of the family gathered around the television, I stepped outside and found Grandpa standing on the porch. The autumn air was cold. Fallen leaves covered the yard, and a sharp wind moved through the trees. "You should come back inside," I told him. He shook his head gently. "I just wanted a few quiet minutes." For a while, we stood together without speaking. Then he surprised me with a question. "Your brother is starting a new chapter in life. What about you?" I laughed softly and told him that work still occupied most of my attention. He nodded. "That is important, but remember to make time for the people who matter." There was a reflective tone in his voice that made me pause. He spoke about how quickly the years pass and how easy it is to assume there will always be more time. Before I could continue the conversation, my mother called me back inside to help clean up after dinner. At the time, I had no idea how important that brief conversation would become. A week later, I returned to my parents' house to collect some documents I had left there. As I walked through the hallway, raised voices coming from the living room stopped me in my tracks. My father and Grandpa were arguing. The discussion centered on the wedding. My father insisted that certain social expectations needed to be considered. He spoke about Emily's family, their professional accomplishments, and the importance of making a positive impression. Grandpa tried to respond, reminding him that he only wanted to attend his grandson's special day. The conversation quickly became emotional. Unable to stay silent, I entered the room. I told my father that excluding Grandpa would be unfair and deeply hurtful. The room immediately grew tense. My parents argued that they were trying to manage complicated relationships and expectations connected to the wedding. I disagreed. To me, family should never be treated as an obstacle to social acceptance. The debate continued for several minutes. Finally, my father told me to stop interfering. I looked across the room at Grandpa. He sat quietly in his chair, his hands resting together, his eyes lowered toward the floor. He offered no defense and made no attempt to argue further. That silence affected me more than any words could have. For the first time, I realized how alone he must have felt, despite being surrounded by family. It felt as though my heart had shattered. I looked at Grandpa and told him that if he was not welcome at the wedding, then I would not attend either. He immediately shook his head. "No, Sarah. You must go." His voice sounded tired and fragile. "This is your brother's wedding. You should be there. Do not give up an important day because of me." I tried to argue, but he only smiled gently and repeated that everything would be fine. For some reason, those words did not comfort me. Instead, they left me with an uneasy feeling that lingered long after I left the room. My father ended the conversation by telling me to stop interfering and focus on supporting my brother. He warned me not to create tension during the wedding celebrations. I drove home that evening feeling helpless. Part of me wanted to fight harder. Another part wondered if everyone else was right, and I was simply letting emotions cloud my judgment. I called several friends seeking advice. Most of them encouraged me to avoid conflict and let the wedding pass peacefully. Even Rachel, my closest friend, suggested that some battles were not worth fighting on such an important family occasion. I understood their reasoning. Still, something deep inside refused to accept what was happening. The evening before the wedding, I decided to visit Grandpa. He lived alone in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where he had spent most of his adult life. When I arrived, the property was completely dark. I knocked several times and waited. Nothing. His vehicle remained parked outside, which made me assume he was home. Perhaps he had gone to bed early. After standing there for several minutes, I eventually left and told myself I would stop by again the following morning. The next day arrived. The wedding venue was breathtaking. Crystal lights reflected across polished floors, fresh flowers filled every corner, and staff moved efficiently through the elegant ballroom. Everything looked exactly as my parents had hoped. I wore my bridesmaid dress, smiled for photographs, and greeted relatives. Outwardly, I appeared calm. Inside, however, I could not stop thinking about Grandpa. I called his phone multiple times throughout the morning. Every call went unanswered. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Jason and Emily exchanged vows, surrounded by family and friends. Guests applauded. My parents looked happier than I had seen them in years. Everything seemed perfect. Yet I could not stop imagining Grandpa spending the day alone. The reception that followed was equally impressive. There was music, laughter, speeches, and endless celebrations. People raised glasses and shared stories, while servers moved between tables carrying elegant meals. At one point, my father stood to address the guests. He spoke proudly about his son, welcomed Emily into the family, and thanked everyone for attending. The room responded with warm applause. I joined in politely, but my thoughts remained elsewhere. I kept thinking about the one family member who should have been there, but was not. Hours passed. As the evening continued, a conversation at our table suddenly shifted in a direction that shocked me. Someone mentioned that Grandpa usually gave meaningful gifts for important family milestones. My mother casually remarked that no one had received anything from him yet for the wedding. Jason seemed surprised by the observation and wondered aloud whether Grandpa had prepared something. Listening to the discussion made me uncomfortable. The focus seemed less on Grandpa himself and more on what he might provide. I reminded everyone that he had not even been included in the celebration. My comment was quickly dismissed. The conversation moved on as though nothing unusual had been said. Around us, music continued to play, and guests continued celebrating. I felt increasingly disconnected from the joyful atmosphere surrounding me. By the time the reception finally ended late that night, exhaustion had settled over everyone. As relatives began departing, my parents suggested making a quick visit to Grandpa's house before going home. Jason and Emily agreed. Without hesitation, I decided to come as well. The entire drive there, an uneasy feeling grew stronger inside me. I could not explain why. Perhaps it was the unanswered phone calls. Perhaps it was the memory of our last conversation. Or perhaps it was simply guilt. When we finally turned onto Grandpa's street and approached the house, I immediately sensed that something was wrong. The property sat in complete darkness. Not a single light shone through the windows. The quietness of the scene felt unsettling. As I stared at the dark house ahead of us, a knot tightened in my stomach, and a sense of dread slowly began to take hold. The moment we arrived, an uneasy feeling settled over me. Something was different. Grandpa's car was gone. My father used the spare key he still had and unlocked the front door. As the lights flickered on, every one of us stopped where we stood. The house looked completely unfamiliar. The living room that had once been filled with decades of memories was almost empty. The furniture was gone. The framed photographs had disappeared from the walls. The television, the bookshelves, even Grandpa's favorite armchair were nowhere to be seen. Only a handful of boxes remained near one corner of the room. On the kitchen counter sat a single envelope. My mother hurried forward while my father picked it up and unfolded the letter inside. As he began reading, the room fell silent. Grandpa explained that he had moved into a senior living community where he could receive support and companionship. He wrote that after careful planning, he had sold the house and organized his finances to ensure he could live independently without relying on anyone else. Part of the money had been used to secure his future care. The remaining funds had been donated to a community program that assisted older adults who struggled with isolation and lacked family support. The letter was calm, thoughtful, and free of bitterness. Grandpa thanked everyone for the years they had shared together. He expressed hope that Jason and Emily would enjoy a happy marriage and explained that he had finally found a place where he felt respected and appreciated. Near the end, he asked that his decision be honored and stated that any future legal matters would be handled through his attorney. When my father finished reading, the silence lasted only a few seconds. Then the reactions began. Instead of focusing on Grandpa's departure, several family members immediately began discussing the money that had been donated. Questions were asked about the house, the savings, and what might have happened if the funds had remained within the family. I stood there stunned. The person everyone should have been worried about was Grandpa. Yet the conversation had already shifted elsewhere. Then my mother turned toward me. Her expression changed the moment she realized my name had appeared in the letter. "You knew about this." I hesitated before answering. I knew he was considering a change, and I helped him explore options that would make him comfortable. The reaction was immediate. Several voices spoke at once. They wanted to know why I had supported his decision and why I had not informed the rest of the family. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It was his home, his savings, his choice. For years, he had made sacrifices for others. This was the first major decision I had ever seen him make entirely for himself. The discussion became more heated. People focused on what had been given away rather than why Grandpa had felt the need to leave in the first place. That was the moment something inside me finally broke. I reminded everyone of the years Grandpa had spent caring for the family. I reminded them how often he had shown up when someone needed help. I reminded them of the support he had provided during difficult times, even when it came at a personal cost. Most importantly, I reminded them that on one of the most important days in his grandson's life, he had spent the entire day somewhere else. Alone. The room grew quiet. My voice trembled as I continued. I told them that family was not measured by money, status, or social connections. Family was built through loyalty, respect, presence, and compassion. Those things could not be bought. Grandpa had spent years offering them freely. The painful question was whether anyone had offered the same in return. No one answered immediately. For the first time that evening, the focus shifted away from finances and toward the reality of what had happened. Across the room, Emily stood silently beside Jason. She had witnessed the entire exchange without saying much. Now her expression reflected uncertainty and discomfort. After a long pause, she quietly suggested that perhaps everyone should leave for the night and give the situation time to settle. No one argued. The celebration that had felt so perfect only a few hours earlier suddenly seemed very far away. And standing inside that nearly empty house, surrounded by the absence Grandpa had left behind, I realized that some losses are not measured by what a person takes with them. They are measured by what people fail to appreciate before it is gone. I was not ready to let the conversation end there. I looked directly at Jason. Do you know what hurts the most? The only times you reached out to Grandpa were when you needed something. A favor, advice about fixing a device, someone to watch your dog, or help solving a problem. But did you ever sit down and ask about his life? The room remained silent. Did you know he spent decades working in aerospace manufacturing? Did you know he devoted years to his profession and took pride in what he accomplished? Did you know he carried the burden of losing his wife while still trying to hold the family together? Jason looked away. The truth was uncomfortable. Not because the information was hidden, but because no one had ever taken the time to ask. He attempted to defend himself, pointing out that none of us were perfect. I agreed. Of course I was not perfect. But there was a difference between being imperfect and being absent. At least I had made an effort to be present in Grandpa's life. I had listened to his stories, celebrated his birthdays, and spent time with him when no one else seemed interested. The tension in the room grew heavier. My father stepped forward and suggested contacting Grandpa through his attorney and arranging a family discussion. The idea immediately unsettled me. Grandpa had made a thoughtful decision after months of consideration. He deserved to have that choice respected. I told them clearly that he needed space and that his wishes should be honored. My mother questioned why I was so determined to defend him. The answer seemed obvious. Because someone had to. I looked around the room at the faces of the people who were supposed to know him best. What I felt at that moment was not anger alone. It was sadness. A man who had spent years supporting his family had quietly walked away because he no longer felt valued. That reality should have broken everyone's heart. Instead, most of the conversation had focused on everything except him. Eventually, I left. The house behind me felt strangely empty, not because the furniture was gone, but because something much more important had disappeared with it. The following morning, I drove to the senior living community where Grandpa had moved. The property was beautiful. Tree-lined walkways wound through carefully maintained gardens. Large windows filled the building with natural light. Residents sat outside talking with one another, while staff members greeted them by name. It felt nothing like the place I had imagined. There was warmth there. There was life. Inside, a receptionist welcomed me with a smile and immediately recognized Grandpa's name. She spoke about him with genuine affection, explaining that he had quickly become one of the most popular residents. As she guided me through the building, I noticed people gathered in common areas, sharing conversations, hobbies, and laughter. Staff members were not rushing past residents. They were engaging with them. People seemed known. People seemed appreciated. When we reached one of the activity rooms, I saw Grandpa sitting at a table surrounded by several residents. They were playing cards and laughing together. A young staff member was joking with the group while explaining the rules of a game. The sound that caught my attention most was Grandpa's laughter. I had not heard him laugh like that in a very long time. Then he noticed me. His entire expression brightened. The smile that spread across his face told me more than words ever could. He introduced me proudly to the people around him. Several residents greeted me warmly, already familiar with my name from the stories he had shared. One of them mentioned that Grandpa often spoke about his granddaughter who visited regularly and always stayed in touch. Hearing that nearly brought tears to my eyes. After his friends gave us some privacy, I sat beside him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Grandpa broke the silence. He wondered whether I was upset with him for leaving. The question surprised me. Upset was not the word. I was sad that circumstances had reached this point, but I respected his choice. I told him exactly that. He nodded slowly. Then he reminded me of the conversations we had shared months earlier. Long before anyone else knew about his plans, he had spoken with me about finding a new place to live. He had worried about becoming isolated. He had wondered whether there might be somewhere he could build new friendships and enjoy greater independence. When he first brought up the idea, I had listened. Together we visited several communities and reviewed the details carefully. I remembered how nervous he had been during those visits. Yet beneath the uncertainty there had also been hope. For the first time in years, he was making a decision entirely for himself. Looking around the bright community room filled with conversation and laughter, I realized that hope had become reality. And for the first time in a very long while, Grandpa truly looked at peace. That day, Grandpa and I spent several hours exploring his new community. We met employees, visited different areas of the facility, and observed daily life around us. The longer I stayed, the more I understood why he had chosen this place. What impressed me most was not the building itself, it was the people. The staff greeted residents by name. They remembered personal details and took time to ask meaningful questions. Conversations were not rushed. They were genuine. Residents were treated as individuals with unique stories, rather than simply people receiving care. Grandpa noticed my expression and smiled. "The people here pay attention, Sarah." He told me about a staff member who had brought him coffee that morning exactly the way he liked it. It was a small gesture, yet it meant a great deal. Someone had listened. Someone had remembered. As he spoke, I realized how rarely he had experienced that kind of attentiveness elsewhere. Then he told me about dinner the night before. Several residents had asked about his career and listened with sincere interest as he shared memories from decades earlier. One gentleman had worked in a related industry, and the two of them had spent hours exchanging stories. Grandpa seemed genuinely excited while talking about it. It was not because he enjoyed being the center of attention. It was because people had shown curiosity about who he was. For years, much of his identity had been reduced to a role within the family. Here, he was something more. He was a man with experiences, accomplishments, friendships, and passions. The more he described life at the community, the clearer it became that he had rediscovered a sense of belonging. No one dismissed his stories. No one treated him as an inconvenience. People listened. People engaged. People cared. That simple difference had transformed his outlook completely. We eventually began discussing the community support fund he had established. Grandpa explained that he wanted the money to help older adults who often felt forgotten or disconnected. He hoped it could support programs that encouraged companionship, meaningful activities, and stronger connections between generations. As he shared his ideas, I understood how carefully he had thought everything through. This was not an impulsive decision. It was a deliberate effort to create something positive for others facing similar challenges. I promised him that I would manage the project responsibly and make sure the funds were used exactly as intended. He squeezed my hand and thanked me. His confidence in me meant more than he probably realized. For years, he had quietly supported my nonprofit work, reading my articles, asking questions about new projects, and encouraging me when progress felt slow. That support had never gone unnoticed. A short time later, one of the staff members stopped by to remind Grandpa about an upcoming performance. Apparently, live entertainment was a regular part of community life. Musicians, students, and local performers visited throughout the month. Grandpa was looking forward to the event and encouraged me to stay. I gladly accepted. The performance space soon filled with residents, chatting and settling into comfortable seats. The atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming. As the music began, I glanced over at Grandpa. He sat quietly, completely absorbed in the moment. There was a calmness in his expression that I had not seen for years. For so long, I had watched him endure loneliness with quiet dignity. Now, for the first time in a very long while, he seemed genuinely happy. Before leaving that evening, I passed through one of the common areas and saw him laughing with a group of new friends. They were sharing stories and joking together while a staff member joined the conversation. The sight stayed with me all the way home. Grandpa looked lighter, more relaxed, almost as though a weight he had carried for years had finally been lifted. About a week later, my parents and Jason requested a formal meeting through Grandpa's attorney. They wanted an opportunity to discuss the recent developments and understand his decisions. The meeting was scheduled at the attorney's office. I attended as well. Not because I intended to speak on behalf of my family, but because I wanted to support Grandpa and ensure his wishes continued to be respected. As I entered the conference room that day, I sensed that the conversation ahead would reveal far more than anyone expected. The meeting began with a clear statement from the attorney. He explained that Grandpa had made his wishes known and wanted those wishes respected. Every decision regarding his move, his finances, and his future living arrangements had been made voluntarily and within the boundaries of the law. The attorney spoke calmly but firmly. He emphasized that Grandpa remained fully capable of managing his own affairs and that all legal paperwork had been completed properly. My father immediately challenged the decision. He argued that the family should have been consulted and questioned why such major choices had been made without their involvement. The attorney listened patiently before clarifying a simple fact. The property had belonged solely to Grandpa. The proceeds from the sale were his to distribute as he saw fit. No one else had authority over those funds. The donation he had made was lawful, documented, and directed toward a legitimate charitable initiative. Any attempt to pressure or intimidate him into reversing his decision would not be tolerated. The room grew tense. My mother insisted that family relationships should give them a greater voice in the matter. The attorney responded that being related to someone did not remove that person's right to make independent choices. Respecting those choices was essential. Eventually, the discussion shifted to a more personal question. Did Grandpa truly wish to distance himself from the family? The answer was difficult for everyone to hear. For the time being, he wanted space. He needed time to build a new chapter of his life without interference. However, he had specifically expressed a desire to remain in contact with me. That revelation seemed to sting more than anything else. My father turned toward me and asked what role I had played in all of this. I answered honestly. I had listened. I had respected his wishes. Most importantly, I had supported a decision he had been considering for a very long time. None of this had happened suddenly. The signs had been there for months. People simply had not noticed because they had stopped paying attention. The meeting ended without resolution. There was little anyone could do. Grandpa's decisions were final. The months that followed brought significant changes for everyone. My parents faced challenges that forced them to reevaluate many assumptions about success and security. Financial pressures increased. Plans had to be adjusted. Certain comforts they had once taken for granted were no longer available. Those experiences were difficult, but they also created an opportunity for reflection. Over time, my mother began questioning priorities that had once seemed so important. Status and appearances no longer felt as meaningful when compared to relationships that had been neglected. For the first time in years, she started acknowledging mistakes she had previously ignored. Jason experienced his own period of growth. Life became more complicated than he had expected, and he was forced to develop greater independence and responsibility. Along the way, he encountered people whose experiences challenged his perspective. One conversation in particular stayed with him. An older volunteer he met during a community program spoke about the importance of presence within a family. The man explained that meaningful relationships are built not through material support alone, but through time, attention, and genuine care. Those words left a lasting impression. Slowly, Jason began reflecting on choices he had made and opportunities he had missed. As for me, I devoted more energy to the community work that Grandpa had inspired. The support fund continued growing and helped launch programs designed to connect older adults with volunteers, activities, and meaningful social engagement. I also expanded my writing. What began as a few personal stories gradually became a larger project focused on sharing the experiences of seniors whose voices were often overlooked. I listened to stories about resilience, loss, friendship, sacrifice, and hope. Many of the people I met had lived extraordinary lives, yet few people had ever taken the time to hear their experiences. The more I wrote, the more readers connected with those stories. Articles were shared widely. Conversations emerged across communities. People began discussing loneliness among older adults and the importance of maintaining meaningful family connections. What started with one grandfather's decision eventually grew into something much larger. His choice had not only changed his own life, it had encouraged others to look more carefully at the people around them and ask a simple question: are we truly seeing the people we claim to love? That question became the foundation for everything that followed. What happened afterward exceeded anything I could have imagined. The articles I published began reaching far beyond our local community. Readers shared them with friends, family members, and social organizations. Messages started arriving from older adults across the country, each carrying a story that was both unique and painfully familiar. Many wrote about loneliness. Others described feeling forgotten, despite having children and grandchildren. Some spoke about spending holidays alone, while others shared memories of relationships that had slowly faded over time. The response was overwhelming. As public awareness grew, local media outlets began discussing the challenges many seniors face when meaningful connections disappear from their lives. The support initiative that Grandpa helped create expanded faster than either of us expected. New volunteers joined. Additional programs were launched. Community centers and care facilities received resources for educational activities, creative workshops, music events, and social gatherings. Everything was guided by the same simple idea: no one should feel invisible. Throughout this process, Grandpa remained deeply involved. Although the funds had originated from his own decision, he never viewed them as money alone. He saw them as an opportunity to help others experience the sense of belonging he had finally found for himself. I continued visiting him regularly. Each time I arrived, I noticed another positive change. He seemed healthier, more energetic, more engaged with the world around him. The sadness that had once followed him everywhere gradually disappeared. One afternoon, I walked into a workshop room and found him teaching a small group of residents. They were gathered around a table working on simple woodworking projects, while Grandpa patiently explained techniques he had learned many years earlier. Watching him share knowledge and experience with such enthusiasm was deeply moving. For so long, those parts of his life had gone unnoticed. Now people listened attentively and genuinely appreciated what he had to offer. After the class ended, we strolled through the community garden together. His section of the garden was thriving. Vegetables, herbs, and flowers filled the space with color and life. As we walked, he shared something that stayed with me. He said that for much of his life, he had believed affection had to be earned through sacrifice and endless effort. Only later did he realize that genuine love does not work that way. Real care is given freely. It is expressed through attention, kindness, and presence. Looking around at the people he had met in his new community, he told me he finally understood what that felt like. The years passed. Change came slowly to the rest of the family. There was no sudden transformation and no magical solution. Growth happened through reflection, mistakes, and difficult conversations. My parents gradually reevaluated many of the priorities that had once guided their decisions. Life taught them lessons that success and status never could. Jason's journey was perhaps the most dramatic. Over time, he began taking greater responsibility for his choices and sought opportunities to contribute to his community. Eventually, he became involved in programs that supported older adults, not because anyone required him to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand people whose experiences had once seemed distant from his own. Several years after the wedding, he finally gathered the courage to visit Grandpa. I happened to be there that day. The conversation was emotional. There were apologies, difficult truths, and long periods of silence. Most importantly, there was honesty. For the first time, Jason openly acknowledged mistakes he had spent years avoiding. Grandpa listened carefully. When he responded, there was no bitterness in his voice, only compassion. That moment marked the beginning of a new chapter between them. The relationship was not instantly repaired, but it slowly became stronger. Trust returned one step at a time. Eventually, other family members began visiting as well. Some meetings were awkward. Others were emotional. Yet each one represented progress. Grandpa welcomed those efforts with remarkable grace. His willingness to forgive did not erase the past, but it allowed everyone to move forward. Meanwhile, the support fund continued growing. Hundreds of seniors benefited from programs designed to reduce isolation and encourage meaningful engagement. New friendships were formed. Creative talents were rediscovered. People who had once felt forgotten found opportunities to connect again. Every milestone became something Grandpa and I celebrated together. One spring afternoon, I found him planting flowers in the garden. The bulbs would not bloom until months later. As he carefully pressed them into the soil, he smiled and said something I will never forget. The flowers were for the future. And for the first time in many years, he was looking forward to that future rather than fearing it. In that moment, I understood what his decision had truly been about. He had not walked away from life. He had chosen to embrace it. Looking back now, the lesson is simple. Family is not measured by appearances, obligations, or expectations. It is built through time, respect, kindness, and genuine presence. The people who matter most are the ones who make us feel seen, heard, and valued. Sometimes those people are relatives. Sometimes they are friends, neighbors, or members of a community we discover along the way. What matters is not where the connection begins. What matters is how we nurture it. And if there is one thing Grandpa taught me, it is this. The greatest gift we can offer another person is not money, status, or possessions. It is our attention. It is our respect. It is the simple act of reminding someone that they matter. That lesson changed my life forever.